Hello everyone, welcome back to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Martichoras, who I will be referring to as Marty for the duration of this video. Now, BL asked me on my previous coverage of this, which is why I'm here back in Jungle Practice, what changes have happened to building Marty due to the new patch? And in the comments, I did respond that generally speaking, the items themselves don't change too much. There are a couple of changes I did want to talk about. I'm not going to be reviewing Marty's abilities here. I am going to assume, for the sake of argument, that you do know what Marty's abilities do. I am going to exclusively talk about building Marty because there are a couple of really significant changes for hunters in general that do affect how you approach building pretty much all hunters. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but also a couple of new things you want to keep in mind when building Marty in view of these changes. Now, the first and most significant thing that has changed for hunters across the board is the reduction in percentage penetration. This is a really big deal because, as I've mentioned previously and continuously, that one of the jobs of hunters is to eliminate towers, and in order to do that effectively, you have to build percentage penetration. Executioner does not work on towers, so you must build percentage penetration. No, you're not going to kick me out of this. So in order to deal with towers, you must deal percentage penetration. Since this has been reduced on a lot of items, actually it's been reduced on all physical items across the board, this becomes harder to do. You need more percentage penetration items to inflict similar levels of damage to towers and also enemy frontline, which is your second sort of job. Now, for Marty, this is a bit easier to do in some ways because Marty has unusually strong ability damage for a hunter. All hunters have one ability that does pretty good damage, but all of Marty's abilities do really impressive amounts of damage. Also, the poison from his auto attacks is fairly interesting as well. But for Marty, this can get a little bit interesting, but the biggest change very specifically is in how I recommend you start with Marty, because that is a really, really important thing that has changed for Marty. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned a few starts, but given the change in percentage penetration for physical items, actually for all items, but for physical items in this specific scenario, you're really going to be looking highly specifically in almost every scenario at, hyper-specifically, Bluestone Pendant as usually going to be your go-to starter item. Now, you might be wondering, Professor, why is this? You mentioned a crit build in the previous episode. Has that changed? I mean, obviously, beforehand, I would recommend grabbing the Ornate Arrow for the crits, and Ornate Arrow indeed has been drastically buffed. And there is a great conversation about that I will be talking about in terms of the crit build, but right now, for majority of the games that I play, Marty has worked best with Bluestone for the very specific reason of upgrading it to Bluestone Brooch. Now, why is this? Well, the primary reason why is because as a hunter, you really want to be blasting out towers and enemy frontline, but with percentage penetration being reduced, we have to get a bit creative with how we're going to be dealing very specifically with the enemy frontline very specifically. Now, why am I not as concerned about the towers? Well, quite frankly, towers themselves, I'm not sure if you're terribly aware of this, but towers themselves have less actual HP, less actual maximum HP when they added the bastions. So the bastions, once they're gone, you're pretty much golden, and the Bluestone Pendant will, in fact, be affected by this. Boom. Oh wait. Bluestone Pendant damage. While Bluestone Pendant doesn't affect towers, obviously, right? Neither does your poison. That's frankly a matter of time for eliminating towers. The more intense struggle you're going to be seeing currently in the current meta as a hunter is eliminating that enemy front line. And upgrading to Bluestone Brooch is really going to help you with that now that percentage penetration is a little bit harder to get to. So right now my go-to item is the Bluestone Pendant with the full intention of upgrading this to Bluestone Brooch. The ability of using Corrupted Bluestone still does technically exist, although this only really exists for extremely specific scenarios, namely those enemy team compositions with a lot of auto-attacking enemy gods. For example, say they have a Jungle Arachne, literally any hunter, and a Soul mid lane, right? That's 3 auto-attackers on their team. That's a preponderance of auto-attackers. You would want Corrupted Bluestone in that situation, especially if their solo lane is also an auto-attacker like Vamon, right? In fact, probably the only person on the enemy team who isn't likely to care about Corrupted Bluestone is the enemy tank, who you're going to be building percentage penetration for in the first place. Anyways, back to the point. So, we have Bluestone. Now, when I approach Marty currently, my second item is pretty much always going to be Transcendence. This is for primarily 2 reasons. One, the power. Since I'll be looking for more percentage penetration, I have to go buy a couple of more extra items for that percentage penetration that we used to have. I'm going to be losing a little bit of power in the long run, and a lot of the ability-based items that I'll be building on Marty do reward the presence of Transcendence. So, I really like to go for Transcendence. Additionally, it is going to give us 10% cooldown reduction, which is already going to be really effective on Marty anyways, but once we get that Bluestone Brooch, that 10% cooldown reduction will be even more important. We're going to go on ahead and build up our stacks on Transcendence there. My third item is pretty much also almost always going to be Soul Eater as well. We're going to go on ahead and grab these stacks as well really quick here. The reason why is because, and this is one of the really big problems here with the change in good old penetration, you'll notice Soul Eater no longer has percentage penetration, it is flat penetration. Now, this is still a worthwhile item to build on Marty for primarily the ability lifesteal. Again, we do have really great ability damage. The power is decent, but again, we're losing a little bit here. We are getting 10 flat penetration, which has its own benefits, specifically against the enemy squishier targets, which we will have to obviously confront at some point, so this will really help us with those. But really, this is more about that great ability healing. This is about that power that you're going to be getting, right? You can actually see here where we get 50 power out of this, which is really nice, right? We get that 10% healing across all of our abilities and our auto attacks. Great time. Really, at this point, it's about that cooldown and the healing and the decent amount of power here, which we love to see. Now, my fourth item, and these first 3 items I don't really change that often. It's very rare for me to not build one of these 3 on Marty right now. The back half changes according to the needs of the situation. A lot of the times, and this is going to be my general go-to that I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll talk about adjustments that I make for specific team compositions. My usual 4th item is going to be the Crusher. Now, this is another one of those items that has been nerfed a little bit here. We do have some nice attack speed increase. We have some nice bonus damage on our abilities. We have, of course, 8% percentage penetration, which is really nice. Now, you may be wondering, well, Professor, why not build this third? Why are you building Soul Eater third besides the healing? Well, first off, Soul Eater does give us that flat penetration, so that's going to be more useful earlier on in the game. It's going to remain useful on the enemy squishier targets, the enemy hunter, the enemy mage, oftentimes the enemy jungler, depending on how defensively they build. But oftentimes, you're going to get more out of that flat pen in the early game, so it's really important to have that there, especially also additionally the healing, which is going to be better for your transitioning into the mid-game phase where people are starting to gank a little bit more heavily. You're starting to see, larger team fights. You're transitioning to that team fight phase and hitting multiple people with a really delightful acid spray or acid rain, or what is this called specifically? Acid rain. I called it acid spray by accident. But the benefits of acid rain in that particular context is you are going to be healing for, each bit of damage you're doing there. So let's say you're going into a team fight and you blast out an acid rain. You're going to be healing off of all this damage you're seeing here. I mean, right now I have the Crusher, so that yellow 9 doesn't. That's not. I'm sorry, the yellow 9 is the Bluestone, but you're not going to be healing off the Bluestone damage or the Crusher backup damage. But you are going to be healing off the core damage there, the orange numbers, the 40 you're seeing, the 300, almost 400 damage you're seeing. You're going to be healing off of all of that in the team fight, and that trail lasts for a little while and continues to heal you. So that's actually, even though it's only 10%, because of how often that triggers in a given 5-on-5 team fight, that actually does heal you quite a bit. And in that mid game, when you're just starting to get into there, whether or not you're ahead or behind, that healing is really going to help you, right? So that's why you really want the Soul Eater as your 4th item. The Crusher generally operates as my 5th item because my passive from that will hit a little bit harder because I'll have more power to work with. I will have my Transcendence fully stacked by that point. I will have my Soul Eater either fully stacked or nearly fully stacked by the time I'm done building the Crusher, and of course the Crusher itself gives 50 power. Now my 5th item is going to usually be the Hydra's Lament. Again, we're looking at some penetration. We have 16% penetration now. Way back before this most recent patch, we would have had 20%. So we're down 4% from what we used to have, unfortunately. Actually, for Pete's sakes, given that Soul Eater used to give 10% penetration, we actually would have had 30% by this point, which is just a great way of seeing how drastically we've lost some penetration. Now, this isn't too different from what I was talking about in an ability-based Marty in the previous episode, but it is at this particular point where you realize, okay, in order to attain similar levels of percentage penetration, our 4th item has to be some form of penetration, and of course, with that comes a certain loss of power. Now, these 4th and 5th items are my usual go-tos. My flex item is usually going to be the 6th. Every once in a while, I'll flex out either the Crusher or Hydra's Lament for a different item. I'll talk about that in a bit, but my 6th item is really going to largely depend upon the enemy team composition. Now, one of my preferences is, generally speaking, either Heartseeker, which is going to give us some bonus ability damage. This is really going to stack well with the Bluestone Brooch. We are doing percentage health damage. You can see where we are almost at that nice 350 there. When we upgrade the Bluestone Brooch, we are actually breaching the 350, which is only possible due to the Transcendence, which is, again, why I build Transcendence as the 2nd item in this particular with Marty. This sort of nerf of percentage penetration does almost force you to build Transcendence if you want to actually attain that 6% max health damage. Right, you can see right there, this effect reaches a maximum of 6% maximum health damage at 350 power. We are barely breaking that, okay, due to the influence of Transcendence very specifically. But in order to really break that, we need Heartseeker, which still, even this, only gives us 24% physical penetration, right? Again, with Heartseeker before the more recent patches, we would have had 40% pen at this particular point. We are essentially and functionally down 16% penetration. So we're never going to get quite that full amount of penetration, which is why Heartseeker and Bluestone Brooch becomes so important here. We are essentially substituting percentage penetration for percentage of health damage. Now you might be wondering, Professor, why choose to go percentage of health damage? Why not go for percentage penetration? Why not build, for instance, as a great example, and it's an excellent question, why not go Titan's Bane? Because you can see we're getting an additional 16% penetration on our ability damage. Why not go this route? Right, we also have the flat 16% penetration there. Why not use Titan's Bane? Well, occasionally I do. Alright, if my team is behind and we haven't taken a lot of towers yet, I will occasionally build Titan's Bane instead. I prefer Heartseeker because, quite frankly, in most situations, it's a matter of time before the towers go down. It is, yes, one of your big responsibilities as a hunter to take those out, but that is a matter of time. the really big important part of a hunter's job, the most significant contribution they can make to a team, is eliminating the enemy front line, which is usually going to be a tanky solo lane and a tanky support. And rather than building Titan's Bane and your first ability cast getting bonus 16% pen, and then you have to wait 6 seconds, which doesn't really work that well on Marty, and I will explain why in a bit. Rather than building this, I would rather have the percentage penetration of the Heartseeker, because first off, we get a lot of power out of that, we get some penetration out of that, and we're doing 6% maximum health for our abilities, which again makes quite a bit of difference here. Where you can see it right here, actually. Let me give you a demonstration with our friend level 20 Odin. And then we're getting the bonus damage here, and then you can see here where we are doing really impressive amounts of damage there as well. Obviously, that first shot only is getting the Heartseeker benefit, but we are functionally really focusing in on dealing huge amounts of damage. We have the poison from our abilities, from Acid Rain. We have the poison from our auto attacks. We have the Bluestone Brooch proccing in the background for 12% of their current health. We have the 6% of their max health running in the background for each ability. We have the Crusher working. We are essentially, functionally attempting to overload the enemy with just hideous and unholy amounts of damage. That doesn't even get into the bonus damage from, of course, Hydra's Lament that we're getting out of this as well. So this is generally how I approach, but of course, again, if for some reason you find yourself really in need of penetration specifically, again, this is usually when your team has somehow not gotten that many towers. Titan's Bane is a great substitute. You do lose only 15 power, you lose some mana, so well, you technically lose more power because you're not getting the 200 mana from Heartseeker, obviously, because of course 3% of that is, you know, getting pulled away, so you're actually technically losing 21 power. It's not that big of a deal, but you're losing a little bit of power for some extra penetration. I'll only really, I'm going to be really blunt here, I'm just going to rip the band-aid right off. Heartseeker or Titan's Bane is a personal preference, outside of towers. Again, if there's a lot of towers left, you're going to want Titan's Bane a little bit more. That 16% penetration on the flat part of Titan's Bane here is also going to affect your auto attacks as well, which is obviously going to do more to towers than the 8% you would get from Heartseeker. But again, towers aren't your chief concern, they're your secondary concern. Your chief concern is killing that enemy front line. And I've personally just found Heartseeker to be a bit more effective at that, because not only do we get at least 8% penetration here, but we are getting that very useful passive. We are getting a little bit more power out of this than as compared to Titan's Bane. So this is what I generally go to for that reason. Now, another item that I will sometimes flex in, and sometimes I'll flex this into either Hydra's Lament or the Crusher as well, is Brawler's Beatstick. I don't recommend this that often, though. The enemy team composition has to be abnormally full of healers, right? I'm talking like they've got a Hell in mid, they've got Ixchel in solo lane, they've got a Ravon in the jungle, you know, just absolutely insane self-healing. Why do I not recommend this? There are very specifically two reasons. One is, obviously, once more, you're not getting that percentage penetration. At this particular point, if you built Brawler's Beatstick, you would have 25 flat penetration, 10 from Soul Eater and 15 from this, which isn't bad. That really helps you against the enemy hunter, the enemy mage, like I said before. But it leaves you with only 16% penetration from the Crusher and Hydra's Lament, which isn't ideal, right? Now, I mentioned that sometimes I will swap Brawler's Beatstick for either Hydra's Lament or the Crusher. The reason why is because anytime I am going to be building Brawler's Beatstick, and usually I'll usually swap out, it really depends on the situation, honestly, a lot of the times. There's benefits to each. This is really more down to your personal preference. I usually drop the Crusher, personally, but if you're more comfortable dropping Hydra's Lament, absolutely go for it, go hog wild. So I'm going to drop the Crusher in this particular case. We're going to swap it for Brawler's Beatstick, but whenever I do make this swap, my last item is always Titan's Bane, because otherwise my penetration is just going to be too absurdly low for this. Right? It's just not going to happen. By swapping Brawler's Beatstick for the Crusher, you're going down to 8% pen with just Hunter's Lament, and even if you built Heartseeker or you built the Crusher as your 6th item, quite frankly, at the end of the day, you're still running around with only 16. This brings us up to 24 and brings us up to the full 40% with the passive every 6 seconds. Now, I mentioned earlier that this doesn't really work that great on Marty, and this is primarily because of how you typically use his 2 damaging abilities, his 2 primary damaging abilities. Usually we'll be, firing your auto attacks, and it's lovely, everything's great. You fire your root, and then you bust out this right afterwards. And you can see where the first ability gets at, so you're not really in a position a lot of the times where the 2 abilities separately are going to get anything. Sure, you can, of course, trigger this deliberately with this, but you can also see right before I use my ult, the poison from this. Wait, let me bust this out here. Oh, I actually have to hit somebody with it for it to trigger. Okay. It's triggered there, right? And then I bust this out, and you're going to see it automatically trigger on the damage, right? This is the primary reason I'm not really a big fan of Titan's Bane on Marty. You're not necessarily going to be in complete control of when that procs, unfortunately. So I'm not the biggest fan of that. I'm also not the biggest fan of Brawler's Beatstick. Occasionally, like I said, on very rare occasions, you just gotta build Brawler's Beatstick. However, I specifically brought up an example of 2 big-time healers, Hell and Ixchel, or possibly Baron Samedi is also very popular in the solo lane, but why such an extreme healing scenario? Because Poisoned Barb reduces enemy healing by 40%. Because of this, Marty does not have a huge, overwhelming need for Brawler's Beatstick. In fact, the only times I've actually needed Brawler's Beatstick is if Hercules or Baron Samedi, very specifically, or Hell, I would say those 3, require Brawler's Beatstick, because their healing is just so egregiously grotesque and unholy that you just need that extra anti-healing to really blast through, particularly in Hercules' case, who's some kind of unholy, absurd nightmare without Brawler's Beatstick. It just gets ugly. So, with the exception of those 3 scenarios, I don't really recommend you go into Brawler's Beatstick, because it's going to really hurt your ability to punch through enemy defenses. Alright? So, keep that in mind. Now, outside of that, there's not really, at least for the ability-based Marty, that's really how I'm going to be approaching him a lot of the time. Now, I want to talk about the crit build, because the crit build is a completely different animal. Now, if you're going to be going specifically for the crit build, I'm going to be, once more, very brutally honest. I don't really build Ornate Arrow that often with this. Why? It comes back to, once again, the penetration reduction. Okay, it's just such a problem for hunters that penetration, that percentage penetration has gone away. I still often stick with the Bluestone Pendant. I will talk about why or not Ornate Arrow when I finish out the build, but let me get into this first. Now, with Bluestone Pendant, and knowing I'm going to be running very specifically crits, this is the situation in which I would go for a item 2 Soul Eater. You'll notice I am very specifically skipping over the Transcendence. There is a specific reason for this. Now, we're going to go into the Soul Eater as a second item. You can still go into Transcendence. Again, I will talk about that. But your third item is going to be good old Rage. We're going to go on ahead and grab our stacks here. Now, Rage is important for a couple of hyper-specific reasons. But I'll talk about that in a second. Your fourth item is going to be Deathbringer. We are very specifically going to be picking up the Malicious Deathbringer just like we did before in the previous build episode with Marty. So here's our Malicious Deathbringer. We're going to be getting that delightful decrease to our abilities. This is relevant. We are running Rage, of course. We have the 45% here. We have 75% here. And our fifth item is going to be the Demon Blade. primarily for that crit strike chance and the 8% penetration when we get these crits, right? So now we are at 95% crit. Not the 100% that we would ideally have, but it's fairly nice. Now at this particular point, we are going to be running the full-on Titan's Bane, and we are going to be running Bluestone Brooch. Now, you will notice that we, first off, are running anywhere from 50 to 70 less power than the ability-based build, which is why I no longer really heavily build the crit build as much with Marty. You will also notice that I put down Titan's Bane very specifically as something I regularly build on this, despite my problems with it. This is because this is the only real major and impressive source of significant penetration that you're going to get your hands on. Okay? At least for Conquest games. There is a caveat to this in non-Conquest. I will get to that in a second. But for Conquest games, you need that pen. You need to be blasting through those towers. You really need the pen from this. You've got 16% default here. You've got 8% whenever you get a crit, and 95% of your autos are going to be crits. So that's not really a huge deal. And we still have Bluestone Brooch because at the end of the day, what we still want to be doing is proccing that as often as possible. So we're just going to be, grabbing our abilities, and you can see how quickly we get these back. So basically what we're doing with the crit build is the same approach as the ability-based build that I talked about earlier, but instead of focusing in on the damage of those abilities, we're instead trying to spam those abilities as quickly as possible through the power of Malicious Deathbringer and grotesque crits. Right? That is functionally what this is doing. I prefer the damage build because it gives us more options for penetration, because crit builds, unfortunately, severely lack penetration now, which has its pros and cons. But you can see where we can just absolutely spam absurd amounts of these abilities, and every once in a blue moon, we're not getting a crit, right? We're getting crits pretty damn consistently, which is great. There was just a miss there, right? After, 20 crits? Somebody will, go back and count them individually, whatever. It doesn't make a huge difference here. I'm just putting that number forth as an approximate. But at the end of the day, that is functionally what you want to be doing with a crit build with Marty, right? Now, when do I build Ornate Arrow? Do I build Ornate Arrow? Why do I avoid Executioner? Well, Executioner, as I've stated before, doesn't affect towers, so in Conquest, I don't build Executioner that often. There are some hunters that I'll build it and percentage penetration, but given that percentage penetration has been nerfed, and in some items outright removed, it's too difficult to try to juggle Executioner and your percentage penetration that you're going to need for your towers, so I generally just go full-on percentage penetration, as you've seen here. But Executioner still has a place. It just isn't Conquest. I typically build Marty more on the crit side in non-Conquest game modes, Slash, Arena, Joust, what have you. Pretty much anything that isn't Conquest, you're going to do a little bit better with Executioner. In fact, when I play non-Conquest Marty, I will, instead of going for Bluestone Brooch and Demon Blade, or even Titan's Bane, I will run a very similar build, but instead my starter item will be the Gilded Arrow into Ornate Arrow, which when we get those full stacks, of course, we're running 35% crit chance here, which is going to get us 110% crit, which is a little bit extreme, but whatever. And then in non-Conquest game modes, I will 100% run Executioner, right? Get that good old... No, you don't get this because you're still going for the Malicious Deathbringer, excuse me. Well, I suppose that's, again, down to your personal preference. With the crit build with Marty, you don't necessarily need the Malicious Deathbringer specifically. I still do build the Malicious Deathbringer personally, but you can go for the Ferocious Executioner. I will go for the Ferocious Executioner if the enemy team composition is unusually tanky, and it's, again, non-Conquest. Say they have 2 warriors and a guardian. I would rather have Ferocious Executioner rather than Malicious Deathbringer, because this is going to give me that bonus increased damage towards those victims, and also reduce their protections by a really nice 24%, which, again, is higher as an individual item than what you're going to see on Titan's Bane. And then if I do, whichever one of these glyphs you feel you need in this situation is obviously what you're going to be getting, right? So whichever one of those you feel the need for. And then my last item in a lot of cases is going to be either Aussie. I've also been known to bust out a Concise on Marty in non-Conquest game modes. Again, it really depends. If I build Ferocious Executioner, a lot of the times this is going to be very specifically Concise. The rest of the time it's going to be Aussie for that lifesteal, that attack speed, that power, right? So it really depends on which one of these two, but I'll usually bust out one of these two at that particular point in time. Other great alternatives, if you don't want the Executioner, is Dominance. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't talk about Dominance with the other two builds, right? Dominance would, on paper, with a crit build, be just as effective as Titan's Bane. Well, frankly, no. It really isn't, and you've probably seen why. Dominance only has the passive 16% penetration on your basic attacks. Titan's Bane has 16% penetration for everything, and a bonus 16% on your abilities. So, between Dominance and Titan's Bane, you are basically sacrificing constant across-the-board penetration for a small attack speed boost of 15%, and only a 16% penetration on your auto attacks, which isn't as ideal, right? So I don't really build Dominance that often anymore, at least not on Marty. There are some hunters that I will still build Dominance for. I'll talk about those down the road, but for Marty, Titan's Bane is just more worthwhile. It really is. Crits or no, a lot of the times, if you're thinking about Dominance, make the correct choice, go Titan's Bane. At least for Marty. There are a couple of other hunters that also do better with Titan's Bane across the board rather than Dominance. Neith, Chiron. These more ability-based hunters, a lot of the times, are going to have a better time with Titan's Bane than with Dominance. But for those more auto-attack focused hunters, which is most of them, I'm talking Hou-Yi, Ram, Artemis, these are generally going to be doing a little bit better with Dominance. And even then, there are arguments, for example, in Artemis's case, where perhaps you would still prefer Titan's Bane. But for Marty, skip Dominance, go right for Titan's Bane. So I only really nowadays build Ornate Arrow in non-Conquest game modes. I primarily only really go for crit builds in non-Conquest game modes, in which the enemy team composition is very squishy, which again is a lot of them. I still like to maintain the Soul Eater, mostly because I really enjoy the flat penetration, because the flat penetration really accentuates the Executioner really nicely here, because this reduction of physical protection is going to happen first, and then the 10 flat goes down, so it really stacks nicely with both percentage and with the percentage penetration or the protection reduction, which is what the Executioner does. But overall, this is my general approach to Marty. So functionally, there are 3 builds. I don't really recommend the crit build anymore for Conquest. If you're going to go crits, don't be in Conquest, right? You're just going to have a easier time building in that penetration you need for ability-based, that first build that I talked about. And again, you don't often need Brawler's Beatstick in most cases. Whether you go for Heartseeker or Titan's Bane is going to be a personal preference of yours. I prefer Heartseeker. I recommend you try both. But this is how I approach Marty now. This is how I approach, additionally, this holds true. What I've just talked about for Marty, as just kind of a last fun fact note, this also applies to Neith and Chiron. Okay? As you probably saw from the Neith video, you'll see a lot of similarities here. Now, you might be wondering why I recommended... This is just to answer a question ahead of time, because I can see the future. And it's an excellent question that I am anticipating that will be asked at some point. You might be wondering, well, Professor, you recommended with the Neith crit build, you recommended Hydra's Lament across the board, but you're not recommending that with the Marty crit build here. Why is that? The primary reason why is because Neith has less conditions to her root, is the short answer to that. Neith's Spirit Arrow, on contact, boom, they're rooted. This is not true of Marty. In order for Marty to root a target as well, you need to hit the next auto attack. And while that's really easy for, stationary targets or slow-moving targets, for example, say I slow down our chum here, Odin, what if I don't have Acid Rain up at the time and I miss like that? Well, I'm not guaranteed to get that Hydra's Lament shot. Hydra's Lament, while still very strong on Marty, is not as so consistent as it is on Neith, because she has, again, a less conditional root. Can you combine Hydra's Lament with the crit build? Absolutely. You 100% can do that. But it's less consistent, and given our current needs for percentage penetration, Titan's Bane, I often find, is a more important item to build on Marty in that scenario anyways. Hopefully that answers that question. With that being said, I do hope this answered your questions on Martichoras. Martichoras? Sometimes I forget because I just always call him Marty. Anyways, I hope this answered your questions on Marty. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.